My name is Val Fitch. It's V-A-L-L-O-G-S-D-O-N-F-I-T-C-H. And the Logsdon is my mother's maiden name. And where Val comes from, I have no idea. Except it was a favorite name of my mother.
Oh, that's great. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you happened to end up at Los Alamos during the war?
I was born on a cattle ranch in northwestern Nebraska in 1923, and actually born on the ranch. And this is about 5 miles from the little town of Merriman, Nebraska. It's in the Sandhills of Nebraska. You probably don't know anything about the Sandhills, but they occupy about a fifth of the state. And it's prime cattle raising country. They're called the Sandhills because that's what the terrain is made out of sand, and the hills are the dunes. It's almost pure sand, such as you find at the shore. But the only thing that can be grown there, really, without destroying the terrain is something that lives off the native grasses, and that is cattle. If you try turning the soil over to grow crops of any kind, then it simply blows away. So that's the Sandhills are dedicated to growing cattle. And my father raised purebred Herefords on the little ranch he had. And the ranch was really too small to be able to support a family on the basis of raising beef cattle. So he raised breeding stock, and that was the enterprise that I was born into. And I have an older brother and sister, both of them now dead. My brother was 10 years older, and my sister 6 years older. But they both started school, and as long as we lived on the ranch, they attended a one-room schoolhouse up the valley. It was about 1.5 miles away. And so most often the school teacher lived in our home, and all three of them would get on their horses in the morning and ride up the valley to go to school. And I always thought this was a little ridiculous, but the important thing is to, go, of course, get out of the house. And so that's how they lived the first few years of their life. Then when my brother came of age to go to high school, then and I was just about ready to start school. Then we moved to Gordon, Nebraska, which is a town about 25 miles to the west. And so all of my K-12 education was in Gordon, Nebraska. And this part of the world is just south of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So there are lots of Sioux Indians around. And my father was always rather close to them. He understood them. As a young teenager, he had bothered to learn their language. And so he was really a great friend of the Indians, which is very rare for white people in those days. And the net result of that was that he was, in 1937, he became an honorary Sioux Indian chief, Chief Eagle Star. And I think to my knowledge, he was the only non-politician who has ever been recognized in such a way. So he received on that occasion a full headdress of eagle feathers, bonnet up here, then eagle feathers all the way to the ground behind. And I inherited that. And just a couple of years ago, I presented it to the local library as part of their Western United States collection. And so it's now out of my hands, but they take good care of these things. Then after high school, I went to Chadron State College, which was, there's a geological formation called the Chadron Formation, but you're getting, Chadron is obviously a name for the formation. But it's where where the high plains start to break away into the lower country in South Dakota. And that's what forms the Pine Ridge Escarpment, and hence the name Pine Ridge. Pine trees grow along that escarpment. And Chadron is right on the escarpment also. So as part of the Chadron Formation. So I guess the only thing I emphasize here is that Indians were always very much present in my young life. And I never learned the language, unfortunately, but it was an interesting thing to have about, an interesting culture to have about. In any event, I went to Chadron State College, and then I graduated from high school in 1940. Of course, in December of 41, you know what happened. And all of us who were 18 years old knew precisely what was going to happen to us within a short period of time. And I did try to volunteer for the Air Force, but was turned down for being colorblind of all things. And so I decided at that time just to wait it out and get as much college as I could before being drafted, and that's what I did. And so eventually, in March of 1943, I was drafted in Fort Warren, Wyoming, sent out to Kearns, Utah for basic training. And then after that, after basic training, the Army was just starting their specialized training program, the STP program. And so I was taken out of regular Army units and sent to ASTP, the unit in Carnegie, what is now Carnegie Mellon. It was then Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh. And I had the choice of going into 4 different areas: chemical engineering, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, civil engineering. Well, I'd already taken, most of the I'd concentrated very heavily on chemistry and physics and mathematics in my previous undergraduate work. And the one thing that I didn't feel I could learn something in was electrical engineering, so I opted for that. Excuse me. So eventually that program, in January of 44, the pressures for manpower were really being felt in the Army, and so they disbanded most of the ASTP units around the country. And so most of my pals in that unit at Carnegie Mellon went off to the 95th Infantry, and then were subsequently part of the European enterprise. There were a number of us, so they were left behind, and I was one that was just sort of plucked out and sent to Los Alamos to work basically as a technician. So that was in December of 1944. So there I was in the Army, and part of a unit called the Special Engineering Detachment, or SEDs. And I was immediately assigned to work for one Ernest Titterton, who was a member of the British mission. So very quickly I sort of became his right or left-hand man, however you want to describe me. And Ernie had a flair for getting involved in interesting things, and I was always there. And I don't know if you're interested in what I did at Los Alamos or not.
I mean, absolutely.
But when I arrived, they were just getting to be seriously involved in the fusion, the implosion program. And there, as is well known, you're detonating explosives in such a way as to produce a shock wave, spherical shock wave going inward to compress, in this case, plutonium to a critical point. And timing of all these explosive lenses is all important. And so I was very much involved in developing the timing apparatus for measuring when the shock wave passes a certain point and so on and so on. And so that's what I did. We developed the electronics for doing that and also made some of the measurements. I should say as an aside that it was a time in my life when, well, obviously the SEDs are a very unusual unit. There was a lot of talent, and I made very, very good friends just among the people at the one end of the barracks that I lived in. And there was Gunnar Thornton, who had a college degree, who had immigrated his parents had brought him from Norway when he was 10 years old. There was Hans Courant, perhaps that name rings a bell with you. He's the son of the famous mathematician. And Hans and I are still, after all these years, still communicate all the time. And when he left Los Alamos to go to finish his college work at MIT after the war, he had a girlfriend at Los Alamos, and he assigned me the job of taking care of his girlfriend. This I did, and we eventually were married, as a matter of fact. So that was a nice story. But also, I learned to ski with this Norwegian there. I had to learn to ski. And also at that end of the barracks, there was Bill Davis, who had been a member of the Dartmouth ski team. And so I had lots of good instruction on skiing. And so that became every Sunday we'd go out to Sawyer's Hill for skiing. And fortunately, many of the famous physicists were also skiers, like Fermi and Kistiakowsky, and you name them. They were probably on the ski slopes with us. I probably had more interaction with these famous people on the ski slopes than I did in the laboratory, as a matter of fact. In the spring of '45, elaborate testing was underway with dummy bombs put in B-29s at Wendover Air Force Base, which is just on the Nevada-Utah border, directly west of Salt Lake City. And the technique was to load the dummy bombs into B-29s there and then drop them over the Salton Sea, where telemetry would pick up the signals from these falling objects and tell people what was going on inside the dummy bomb as far as all the timing mechanisms were concerned, whether they were functioning correctly. And so in the spring of '45, I was one of those sent to Wendover, another SED that I worked with, whose name was Bud Lang, and I went out and we set up a little laboratory on the edge of the field and to initiate this testing program and also to educate some of the Army officers there so that they could carry it on after we left. And so that was my first exposure to B-29s and bombs and all that. But in my memory, I went out to Wendover from Kirkland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. And riding in an old B-17 bomber, and we were just over the Wasatch Mountains, and they weren't far below, and a second engine went out, and so we were all asked to get on parachutes and and so on and so on. So it was quite a trip. That was, and in that respect, but it was also characterized by the fact that, of course, during World War II, if you were ever out of uniform, well, you were automatically thought to be a deserter. So you were absolutely required to wear a uniform at all times, all those in the military. But there was a special dispensation for this group of SEDs who went out to Wendover, because for security purposes, we had to play the role of, quote, scientists from Washington. So we were given money, and we went down to Santa Fe and bought civilian clothes, including shoes, in order to have something to wear at Wendover. So there we were, civilians, and I still have this piece of paper that gives me permission to wear civilian clothes. It's one of these memos which mean so much at the time, of course, wearing civilian clothes after all these years in a military uniform. In any event, then it wasn't long after we came back that we went to Trinity to start the testing program there. And initially, as probably you know, the first test was of setting off 100 tons of TNT. And with that, we tested all the firing mechanisms and so on to make sure that signals were getting through, all that. The main control for the test was, the main control bunker was 10,000 yards, which is slightly less than 6 miles from the gadget itself. And so it was a job of Titterton's group in the end to send out the signal to detonate the things at the appropriate time, but also to send out preliminary signals to various experimental groups that needed signals in anticipation of the thing going off. For example, photographers had to open their shutters, et cetera, maybe a few milliseconds beforehand. So we did the fast timing, and actually another name, Bill Elmore, and his SED did the slow timing, which consisted of a rotating drum with electrodes in it, picking up signals. So we did the fast timing and sending out the main detonation pulse at the end of the timing interval. By we, I mean in the main control bunker there was just Titterton and myself, and we did have a technician down there. His name was Calvin Linton, who helped out hauling things around and so on, putting things together. The fourth member of the team his name was Russ Lowry, and his prime concern was the apparatus that we used to measure the simultaneity with which all the detonators were fired around on the bomb itself. There were 32 of them, and it was our job to measure the degree of simultaneity of those detonators firing. And of course, that's just where my previous experience had come in and so on. And so Russ was nominally in charge of the recording of that data, which was done in a bunker about half a mile west of the tower. And so we had pull in all the apparatus to make those measurements, fast oscilloscopes and so on, and got all that stuff ready, and running cables up to the tower and up to the bomb to carry the signals back to the recording apparatus. So that was a secondary measurement that this little group of just 4 of us, plus including the technician, that's what we were doing at the bomb test. And actually, it was 2 or 3 days after the test when Lowry made a very quick trip into the bunker to retrieve the film on which the data was recorded. And unfortunately, when it was developed, the film was totally black. I mean, radiation had just been too much for it. And the blast when the bomb went off, the blast had taken all the earth that was piled over this bunker and just blew it back and blew it off the bunker totally. And then between that bunker, which was, as I said, half a mile west, and the tower, then maybe a third of the way up, why the sand had all been turned to glass. You've probably seen Trinitite. And so when the time to set off the bomb approached, why Tittert and I were at the main control bunker, and Lowry was back at base camp, which was 5 miles further away. And I don't know if you've seen photographs of those places or not, but they're rather interesting. I have some upstairs if you'd like to see them. But just as far as our timing measurements are concerned, that was all done automatically, of course. Since one is measuring times in milliseconds, it can't be there. Can't be somebody throwing a switch. It all had to be automatic. So that was all in its automatic mode. And then Titterton suggested, well, maybe if I wanted to go out and take a good look at what was going on, why go ahead, because we couldn't do anything about it. So I went outside the bunker and around to the east side, and there were 2 or 3 others. Kistiakowsky was another one who went out, left the bunker and went out to get a good view of things. And of course I had this piece of welding glass to cover my eyes with, and which I've also kept as a memento of the occasion. But sprawled out on the ground with the glass tightly kept over my eyes. Of course, initially I was looking away from the tower, but that enormous flash of light, of course, just overcomes any lack of transparency in that welding glass. And it's just it's the most surprising thing of all, is a fantastic flash of light. And then, of course, you see the dust cloud and the ball slowly rising off the ground, and the famous mushroom cloud eventually. So I got up off the ground to get a better view of that, and totally forgetting that the shock wave had yet to arrive. So it might take only 30 microseconds for the light to arrive, but it takes about 30 seconds for the shock wave to arrive. So I had plenty of time. Once I realized the shock wave had yet to arrive, I had plenty of time to get back down on the ground and hear that fierce rumble, and first that blast, and then the rumble of the sound off the nearby mountains, echoing off the mountains. It was on any score, it's hard to understate that. One's reaction to, I'm sorry, it's hard to overstate one's reaction to
Do you want to
this.
start that again? Just say it's hard to overstate.
Well, it's hard to overstate the impact on the senses for something like that. First, the flash of light, that enormous fireball, the mushroom cloud rising thousands of feet in the sky. And then, a long time afterwards, the sound, the rumble, thunder in the mountains. And they're just, words haven't been invented to describe it in any accurate way. So one thing you allude to, and something I quoted when I wrote a little piece about these experiences that you apparently read. As a matter of fact, you put in your book about the Manhattan Project. After it was over and people would start milling about and coming in and out of the main control bunker and so on, there was an MP on duty at the door, just a single MP. He was supposedly there to control access, even though I think it had to be mainly symbolism, because the security was just knowing each other, not, and of course the MP didn't know anyone. So, but in any event, I saw him with an absolutely ashen face, and I simply remarked to him, "Oh, the war will soon be over," and that was my main reaction at the time. And of course, I was right, fortunately. I stayed around for 2 or 3 days to, actually Linton and I stayed around for 2 or 3 days to pack up equipment and take the stuff back to Los Alamos. And we were driving an Army panel truck. Linton was driving, and as we were leaving the place, we were at South 10,000, but we had to go out past where the tower had been to leave the site. And so as we were passing by the tower, the road passed perhaps a mile west of where the tower had been. Well, we turned up the road towards where the tower had been and past that small bunker that we'd instrumented at half mile west. And there, the cables that we had so laboriously strung to the tower were just flung back over the bunker, and all the earth that had been piled on top of the bunker was gone. It was just sitting there bare. We drove on a bit further to the point where where the sand had been turned to glass, and I pulled a little box out of the back that had contained a filament transformer, and I reached down to that box and scooped up some of the glassy material. And then we didn't know what the radiation level was, but thought it was a good time to get out of there, so that we did. So I still have some of that trinitite that I picked up myself. It was a couple of years after that I went back to Los Alamos to work for the summer, and I came across an old stockroom where stuff was stored, the circuit that would use to put the signal on the line to trigger the bomb, the basic trigger circuit. It's a high voltage trigger circuit. We had, I don't know, maybe 2,000 volts on the pulse to make sure it got through. And so at the time I was wondering about, well, maybe I should call that to somebody's attention, because no one else, I'm sure, except me, knows what that is. But of course, I didn't do it. It's undoubtedly scrapped with everything else at one time or another. I was discharged almost exactly 3 years after I entered the Army from Fort Bliss, Texas, and then went back and worked at Los Alamos to make some money, doing the same job I had before, but this time making a reasonable amount of money. And I had none, so saving a little money for college was important. And so I worked there for another 1.5 years after being discharged. Let me say a little more about the SEDs, because they're not properly advertised. Right. Richard Rhodes has virtually nothing to say about the SEDs in that otherwise fine book. But by the end of the war, about 50% of the technical personnel at Los Alamos were SEDs. And they lived in barracks, we ate in the mess hall, worked in something called the technical area for civilians. And when we were in the technical area, the military couldn't touch us. But of course, we ate in the mess halls, and we slept in the barracks, and anytime you have 60, 120 men collected by the Army's pretty good about making sure that a certain amount of order is kept. And so there were Friday night scrub sessions, cleaning out down the barracks, and Saturday morning inspections. When I first arrived there were also 6 o'clock calisthenics, but that aspect was discontinued after Kistiakowsky raised Cain with General Groves himself. Thanks to Kistiakowsky, because he knew he relied his group, which was involved in producing the lenses for the implosion gadget, was staffed largely by SEDs, and so he was working probably more closely with more of them than anyone else in the whole project, and so he was terribly concerned about the way they were treated, and he was expecting them to work, 24 hours a day, but they had all this other nonsense to do. So he complained about the rather spit and polish attitude of the military that was there, complained directly to General Groves, and as a matter of fact threatened to leave the place if it wasn't changed. And of course Groves said, well, I can't do that. But in fact, in a week or so after Kistiakowsky's complaint, things were transformed around, and it became a much easier life. We didn't have to get up at 6 in the morning, and never did we have any KP or anything like that. The mess hall was staffed by indigenous labor, and supervised by a mess sergeant, but it was staffed by and after the Kistiakowsky effect, we no longer had to clean the latrines. That was also our responsibility until he caused things to soften. One job we always had, and that was keeping the stoves going in the wintertime. In each barracks there were, as I recall, 3 or 4 pot-bellied stoves in the center aisle, bunks on either side, in the center aisle of the barracks, and somebody had to keep those fires going in the wintertime. Los Alamos has a wonderful climate, but it does get a fair amount of snow in the wintertime, and it can get rather cool. In the case, in our barracks, we just hired one of our willing members to do the job, and he was happy to do it, to have some more money to send home, and so he took care of the stoves. We just all chipped in, and that individual, as a matter of fact, was Bill Davis, who I described earlier as having been a member of the Dartmouth ski team. So when you look at some of the alumni of the SEDs, probably you've met Ben Peterson. He was one. As a matter of fact, he lived in my barracks, but at the other end. And then there was Peter Lax, who became a very well-known mathematician. As a matter of fact, the mathematicians finally have set up a prize that's equivalent to a Nobel-Prize. And he won the very first one.
If you could talk about the role of the British, one of the things I'm going to try to do is get the London Museum interested in, sort of having this exhibit come their way.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about how this really was an Anglo-American effort and what the British contributions were and what it was like at Los Alamos, how many, I guess there were 20 some.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because there's a great tendency in this country to forget about that component and their contributions to the. There's a book about it, though. A book that's been written by a professor of history at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. He has a rather peculiar name.
Frank Saz.
But it's all about the role of the British mission.
Right.
But, well, one can tick off the names. Of course, Niels Bohr was one of the members of the British mission. And Chadwick. Chadwick was the leader. There was Peterson, there was Tony French, who is going to be speaking at St. Louis next month. He's taking my place, as a matter of fact. Then, of course, there was Otto Frisch, one of the authors, along with Peierls, of that original report that showed that, in fact, it was possible to make bombs. There was, what was his name? The one who stayed on for long. But, of course, Peierls himself was a member. So both Peierls and Frisch, who had been instigators in the original report. Interestingly enough, they were working on this because they couldn't work on the really super secret things going on in Britain at the time. They didn't have clearance. So working on the ramifications of the fission process, they did, because it was totally unclassified, and they could play around with it without having to. They couldn't work on radar, which they should have been doing. So they had this time available, and they chose to work on the ramifications of fission. I once talked to Serber about that report that they put together, and they had calculated that the critical mass might be as little as 1 pound of U-235. And as you know, the first weapon had something like 140 pounds of U-235. So quite different from the 1 pound. But Serber's observation was, well, it's a good thing they made that particular error. It wasn't an error. They simply didn't have the correct cross-section information. So they used wrong cross-section information. When that was updated, why their calculations were correct. But Serber's comment was perhaps if one was in favor of making the bomb, that was a good mistake to make, because if they'd said 130 pounds, no one would have ever tried to make it to begin with, which I thought was an interesting observation.
That's good.
Well, both Frisch and Peierls were refugees from Hitler's Germany. They were in England largely because of the efforts of Oliphant, Mark Oliphant, who made it his business to make sure that those people had some place to go to when they left Germany. And even though he didn't have a real job for them, somehow he managed to create a job for them in his university environment. And Oliphant had been the director of the laboratory that had turned out the magnetron, the cavity magnetron, which had been instrumental in the development of radar for use in airplanes. We would not have had radar in airplanes without the cavity magnetron. And it was Oliphant who brought a sample over to the United States, I think in 1941 on that same trip when he was trying to sell the atom bomb project. Brought the cavity magnetron to the United States. Oliphant was really a great man, and it turns out that Ernest Titterton, for whom I worked, had been a graduate student of Oliphant's. So there's that connection. And Oliphant, after the war, went to Australia to found the science section of the Australian National University. And Titterton went along with him. That was roughly 1948, 49. He died at the ripe old age of 96 or so, just 2 or 3 years ago. And of course, he was an avid advocate of getting rid of weapons, of nuclear weapons altogether, and worked very hard towards that end, right to the end of his life. So in my book, Oliphant's a great hero.
That's great. Where were you and how did you learn about the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima? And did you support that at the time?
Well, you have to understand I was a GI, and I had many friends in the military. And many of those friends, it turned out, were training for the invasion of Japan in the Philippines. They've told me all about this afterwards, thanking me for my participation in the original project. And I understand that totally. Somehow, people who have never been shot at don't appreciate what it's all about. So, just as as another GI, in effect, wanting to get home, get this whole thing over with, I certainly could not be against it. And as I told the MP outside the bunker door at Trinity, the war will soon be over, and it certainly was. So I would have to say that I was in favor of it. It wasn't until, and I'm still in favor of it, there's no doubt. There are any number of people walking around today, who wouldn't be walking around simply because their fathers or their grandfathers would have been killed in Japan invading that island. I'm convinced of that. So it had in my own mind, just shutting down that war was in a sense worth it. But that's not to say that we shouldn't do everything we can to put that genie back in the bottle and keep it there. So, and certainly my sentiments have been along those lines ever since. I think to have the military-industrial complex or dictate the speed with which we arm ourselves and so on is totally wrong. And somehow we have to learn to turn off the influence of the hawks, of the super hawks. And that turns out to be awfully hard, simply because they know how to spend their money to get the largest political support. Even things like the B-2 bomber, which, we have 22 or 23 of them, and I noticed one of them crashed off Guam the other day. And of course, they only cost a couple of $1 billion apiece. But it's a nonsense weapon. Has no utility whatsoever. In a serious war, they would be the first to go, without any impact whatsoever. I'm convinced of that. Let me say I have some additional qualifications when I make these statements. I mentioned to you at lunchtime that I'd been a member of JASON since its founding, and before that, part of the Project 137 group. And then later, in 1970, I became a member of the President's Science Advisory Committee, PSAC. And PSAC had a number of standing panels, and I happened to have become chairman of the strategic panel, which meant that we dealt with about all the strategic forces in the military. So I became quite an expert on that, and I know what's involved. But no matter what has happened, I remember when the Minuteman was first being proposed, and the question is, how many Minutemen do we need? How many Minutemen do we need? You know, those rockets with they're an elegant design, but they have a single warhead at the top. And so it was calculated that it would take 400 to demolish absolutely any reasonable target in the Soviet Union, or I should say all reasonable targets, 400 of them. So they just automatically then more than doubled that and went to 1,000. And that's the way things get escalated again and again and again. The other thing, as a member of PSAC that I was involved with, besides the strategic panel, was the so-called safeguard anti-missile system. You've probably forgotten all about them. Well, it was probably before you were born, but not quite. But the safeguard system was something that Nixon was pushing very hard. And it involved constructing a big phased array radar up in North Dakota and using Bomark missiles, which are nuclear tipped as the weapons, so you didn't have to worry about precisely hitting the missile coming in. If you came close, why, it was good enough. But this whole safeguard system was funded. This enormous phased array, hardened phased array radar was built in North Dakota. It's the size of a Giza pyramid, concrete, fully equipped, and never staffed. And it cost $20 billion in 1972 dollars. Just an enormous waste of resources. And, well, we now know that the country doesn't have them to throw away anymore, but we were certainly throwing them away then. I'm talking about the resources. And so much of what happens in the military is precisely along those lines. And it's all, as near as I can tell, driven by those elements of the military industry, the aerospace industries. They cleverly arrange for all the contracts, for example, the construction of the B-2 bomber, to be allocated on the basis of certain congressional districts to satisfy the demands of the clients of the congressman in those particular districts. And the congressman can proudly point to the things he's bringing into that district point to these things from the government. And that particular part of the well, Eisenhower had it right. The military-industrial complex is a very real and always present danger. And somehow we've never been able to handle it and deal with it. Make sensible decisions. What other prejudices do I have?
This is good. This is very good.
The other thing I guess I wanted to say is PSAC was very much against the anti-missile system that I just described. But it was also very much against the SST, which was being considered, and this was during the Nixon administration. And some of the members of PSAC were quite, probably, since they were members of PSAC, they shouldn't have been so loud in their opposition. But the net result of this was that the Nixon administration fired us all, and there was no more PSAC. So one of my prized possessions is a letter from Nixon saying, PSAC no longer exists. You no longer have a job on PSAC. But that was 1972 or so.
Wow.
And I've actually, since then, I've had very, very little to do with any, except for things being having to do with, say, the National Science Foundation. I've had nothing to do with any classified work since then, since I was fired from PSAC. So that was a clean cut.
Okay, you have, in '99, you and 31 other Nobel laureates in physics urged the Senate to approve the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
Right.
And then in 2000, you and 49 other Nobel laureates urged Clinton not to deploy an anti-ballistic missile system. So maybe you want to talk about these initiatives and how scientists have become politically active, like yourself, and what you hope to accomplish.
Well, you're quite right. I think in your questions you suggest that it all started with the Manhattan Project, and certainly the evolvement of the Manhattan Project into something that was civilian controlled, I think, was entirely due to the activism of scientists after World War II. Of course, the military was keen on getting control of that, but fortunately, the AEC, well, you know that there were some abortive efforts to make it, to give it international control and so on and so on, but it all ended up with the Atomic Energy Commission, which I think was a pretty reasonable way of doing things, and but that was, I would say, almost entirely due to the activism of scientists. And of course, there was the establishment of the Federation of American Scientists, and in Chicago, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists started to be published. And these, I think, have been very effective organizations. Entirely inspired by physicists, by and large. And of course, as time went on, why other sciences got involved, but the initial inspiration, I think, really came from physicists. Almost entirely. Though there were some like Paul Doty, who was a chemist at Harvard, who was certainly very active. But and Kistiakowsky, I always think of as a physicist, not a chemist, but he would describe himself as a chemist. And then there was just the establishment of PSAC, which originally consisted almost, I'd say, entirely of physicists. It was during the Eisenhower administration, and what Killian, who had been the president of MIT, was the first chairman of PSAC. And that was a very effective organization in advising the president, bringing scientific input to the forefront. And I know when I first went on PSAC, Lee DeBridge, who had been head of the radiation lab at MIT during the war, subsequently become president of Caltech and then became head of PSAC, the President of the Science Advisory Committee. It was just very active in advising the executive policy. I remember in those days when policy questions arose in the government, various departments of the government would have to sign off. State Department, CIA, and so on. Well, PSAC was another agency that had to sign off on these things, so they were privy to all these rather important decisions being made. And it was a time when the chairman of PSAC had his office. It was in the old old executive office building, which before up through World War II had been the State Department, as you know. And as a matter of fact, Lee DeBridge's office was which had been inhabited by Cordell Hull during the war. So, and well, I mean, I say this to give you some idea of the high esteem with which science was held in the government up until, I'd say, the early 1970s. And after Nixon got rid of PSAC, then everything pretty much fell apart. And as you know, the president, so-called, there's something called a science advisor now, but it's Office of Science and Technology, and it's off on 17th Street someplace in some obscure building. And near as I can tell, the chairman is pretty much a eunuch. I mean, I won't mention his name. He's a Princeton graduate. But it's having an effect. The answer is no. Of course, in this present administration, you can understand why. But in any event. But originally, that was not the case, and it all started to change in the early 70s, I'd say.
Do you want to talk about secrecy at all, and how Leo Szilard was very frustrated with secrecy that wasn't just during the duration of the war, but afterwards, and how he felt that the biggest impact of the Manhattan Project was not the bomb, but the secrecy stamp. And how, I mean, I don't know, maybe you didn't experience this. He was frustrated. His petition, or the petition he started, to try to get to Truman and persuade him, to have a test or whatever, it got stopped. And, Groves did not.
Now, certainly Groves was a strong one on compartmentalization and so on, but Oppenheimer found a way around that. And certainly at Los Alamos, you didn't feel, one didn't have any, even for low-level people like me, we didn't have any sense of compartmentalization. But that was Oppenheimer's doing, not Groves.
So did you see Groves at all? Do you have any interactions with him?
No.
No.
Well, I mean, when he would come to Los Alamos, why, the SEDs would have to get out and parade. But I think that happened once, and that's the only time I ever saw him. But that was, as a matter of fact, I think I mentioned someplace that in his book, what was the name of it?
Now It Can Be Told.
He never mentions the SEDs at all. And here, he was our commanding officer. So, on the other hand, he's an absolutely brilliant administrator, apparently. And how anyone in that position could have chosen Oppenheimer still amazes me. And it was just a perfect choice.
Great.
That's a separate and sad story, of course, the Oppenheimer story, but he was certainly the perfect selection for that job. And Groves had to stick his neck out a long ways to make that happen. I mean, so I admire him very much for that.
Do you want to talk about the Oppenheimer story?
Yeah. One of the great tragedies of our generation. Well, with regard to the Oppenheimer affair, I consider that to be a real tragedy in the history of our country, and it does not speak well for how the country sometimes operates. It was all because of the vindictive nature of a few people with high positions in Washington that Oppenheimer at one time or another had managed to insult. and they never forgot it. Oppenheimer was an incredible resource for this country. And because of that, they threw that talent down the drain. I think that's just it's a crime and shouldn't be allowed to happen. Priscilla McMillan wrote a wonderful book about the Oppenheimer case. It's entitled something like The Ruin of J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Start of the Cold War. Words to that effect. And I highly recommend it. It gives a very good account of the nasty doings of these people, these vindictive people who did Oppenheimer in. Of course, this is not long after the McCarthy era, and you'd have thought that this kind of thing would have been impossible, and just as a reaction to the miserable McCarthy period. But no, it just continued on, and just personal nastiness that was involved. Now, I have deep feelings about that, and he was such a talented person, and to throw that talent down the drain is too much for me.
I don't know. One of the things that in your autobiography you say the Manhattan Project was a time when the mind was to wander freely and invent new ways of doing the job.
Well, certainly the Manhattan Project had an enormous effect on my own career. After being at Los Alamos, I knew precisely that I wanted to go into physics, and that was not so clear beforehand. But I liked what I saw of physicists at Los Alamos. I liked them very much as people, and I just came to anticipate having a collegial relationship with them with great joy, and that's what's happened. And now, with respect to what I'd learned at Los Alamos, one thing I learned was that I became very skilled at electronics. And so in doing experimental physics, I was never limited by those instruments that were available and on the shelf and you could simply buy. But I could go out and invent my own. I knew how to do it. And it gave me enormous freedom to tackle things which I would not otherwise have been able to tackle in addressing problems in physics. I had a very successful PhD project. And a lot of the success came from just that kind of what do I want to say? Kind of application of knowledge about all kinds of things, which didn't have any particular frontier, or at least a frontier that was easily pierced. I could always go beyond what seemed to be the limiting factors in devising new instruments and so on. And so for me, that's been an enormous advantage in doing experimental physics. And I think that's basically what I meant when I said that statement. I've not felt constrained by what I see directly in front of me, including that.
Maybe you can make a couple of sort of summary statements about how the Manhattan Project changed science or physics.
Well, as you know, before the Manhattan Project, the only sources of support for any kind of science were private. And it was normally some well-to-do person having some extra cash to spend on something like the Palomar telescope or whatever. It was all private money. And the Manhattan Project then showed the way for the government to spend money on science and in a constructive way. And out of it, of course, the Office of Naval Research evolved, and that office did many constructive things in supporting science. Later, the Atomic Energy Commission picked up the reins, and then, as you know, the National Science Foundation was created as a direct result of things like the Manhattan Project. So the ramifications of the Manhattan Project have just been without bounds, as near as I can tell. And unfortunately, and as time has gone on, the government funding has been so successful that private companies have tended to give up doing basic research. Prime example, Bell Labs no longer exists. And IBM used to spend something like, I don't know, back in the certainly 60s, 70s, they used to spend something like $500 million on their research laboratories, but no more. So they've essentially left that for the government to do. And I think that's a tragedy. But gradually we're learning to deal with it, but at the same time, Congress doesn't really realize that this has happened and that they now have a responsibility, whereas before it was a shared responsibility, now it's entirely a responsibility of the government to support basic research. And as I said, I'm afraid most congressmen don't really appreciate that, as near as I can tell anyway. They have left the leadership in certain fields entirely to the Europeans. For example, high energy physics. Congress killed the collider that was being built in Texas after $2 billion had been spent on it. They simply canceled it. And all of that activity now is taking place at CERN. CERN, Japan, Germany have all picked up where the United States has, by default, let it go. And I feel sad about that because it's my own area of particle physics that has suffered the most, perhaps. And at the same time, we can spend enormous quantities of money on absolutely foolish wars, et cetera, et cetera.
Basically, the presence of nuclear weapons today, and what you think, is there a possibility that we could eliminate nuclear weapons?
I would certainly like to think that somehow we will be able to eliminate nuclear weapons from the world. Clearly it has to be done incrementally. A certain amount of progress has been done, but it's been, compared to the total problem, what has been done is microscopic. And someone has to take the lead and drastically cut numbers. And of course the United States is the only, and the Soviet Union, I suppose, are the only ones who are really able to take the lead in this respect. And the hawks in our society are not going to let that happen very easily anyway. At the same time, I find that that's just one heck of a way to control a population and start a nuclear war. And it will eventually come to that unless one takes some action. One can only envision something is going to happen that's going to be very, very catastrophic unless we learn to cut those things, hopefully, to zero. But so what to do? All one can think of doing is whenever any opportunity arises to express contempt for the present situation, certainly contempt for the people who are responsible, and that I'm getting really good at.